Guys, everybody, thank you for being with us today. Very, very, very excited to be with you all. As Andrew mentioned, my name is Henri Arslanian, and my passion and my focus in life is the future of money and crypto. And today we're going to talk about exciting developments going on in the regulatory space in crypto. It's called regulatory advances in crypto. We'll see if we're making advances. And I promise you it's going to be insightful, interesting, and most definitely exciting as well. And to do this, we have a dream team panel today. Andrew introduced them. Malcolm Wright, as you saw, who heads the Director of Regulatory Affairs, APAC for GDF. By the way, Andrew introduced him, but one thing you probably don't know about Malcolm, he used to be afraid of speaking in public 10 years ago. He changed a lot since then. So Malcolm, great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Henri.
Next is Henri, as mentioned, he's the head of legal and government affairs at TRM Labs. But actually, before that, he was a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice, and he spent 2 years as a senior official at the U.S. Treasury Department. So either you guys love him or you hate him, but you'll see how it goes.
Love, let's love.
But one good thing, by the way, about Henri, he's run 26 marathons. So here you go. Who said people in crypto were not exciting? And Reno, last but not least, is a chief compliance officer at Trulioo. One thing about Reno is interesting. He was born in Zambia, and he's lived in 3 different continents and 8 different states. Man, that makes your tax filing quite complicated. But we'll talk about that on a different panel, not for this one. Guys, very excited to kick it off. Before we really jump into some of the details, today we're going to talk about things like from AML to travel rule. What do we see? What are the big strengths? What are the things to watch out for? But really, to set the scene a bit, I'll start with you, Henri, and then I'll move to you, Malcolm. From a scale to 1 to 10, where do you think, if we had to give a score or grade to the U.S. regulatory framework, what score would you give to the U.S. regulatory framework, and what do you think needs to be done to improve it?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question, and I promise you this is not a cop-out, sort of not providing a score, but we're 3, 2, 1, and part of it is this is such early days in the space, right? I think sort of the holy grail today of crypto regulation is this idea of a comprehensive framework. And sort of kicking things off, talking about sort of the free market and the need for responsible innovation, I think what we're seeing right now is a need for business in the crypto space to have some regulatory clarity. Because business doesn't work unless sort of you know what the expectations are from regulators. So I think what we're seeing right now is a piecemeal set of regulations and enforcement actions that are starting to build out that framework, but it's still really so early. And quite frankly, no US president had spoken about crypto at all. And today we now have an executive order that came out in March, and just last week or the week before, pretty much every federal regulatory agency in the US responded to that executive order. And it really started to build out what a regulatory framework could look like. But the reality is that Congress, the legislature has to act, and we're probably still some time from that actually happening.
So on 3 out of 10, Malcolm, what do you give, let's say, from an Asia perspective? Not to pinpoint Singapore or Hong Kong, but let's say, what score would you give to the region?
I don't think there's any clear winners at the moment. We have to say that, I have to say Singapore is doing well here. The regime has kind of been building up over a period of time. I think there's a wish and a desire for there to be more licensed firms here, but there is a push to make sure that those firms that are going through the process do actually have the right controls and everything else in place. Hong Kong's getting there. The next phase of its regulation is coming. That's going through the legislative process at the moment. Japan has taken a slightly more measured approach. It's kind of been over a period of time. And then Korea came in fairly hard last year and sort of locked the doors quite carefully. So there's different ways of kind of approaching it.
Well, okay. One thing
that I think is part of the whole problem is that there's no sort of single way about all of how this is done.
That's right.
And that doesn't help.
Frankly, I was going to say, so in Europe, we saw sort of an agreement on MiCA, which is the Market and Crypto Assets Act, over the summer. Well, yesterday I read that might be potentially in jeopardy. And that was really the only comprehensive framework in the world for crypto. So, you walk through the hallways here and you say, wow, we have a mature industry of like really extraordinary companies. But on the regulatory side, I mean, it is so early.
Yeah. Well, actually, let me move to you, Reno, on that side. On the KYC side, which obviously an industry went through a big revolution the last couple of years. Now KYC has become pretty much mainstream, whether people like it or not. We talk about regulatory advances. Is there a way, from your perspective, that we can make KYC better, more effective, more efficient, and frankly, more user-friendly?
Yes.
All right.
I want to hear that.
So KYC is pretty broad. It covers a lot of things. So I'll talk specifically about the onboarding piece.
Yeah.
So
I think what people matters with many
yes. So as part of the onboarding of customers, there's a collection of their core data elements: name, date of birth, address, and then there's a verification that's required to be done. For the verification piece, if I go to Exchange A and I sign up for an account, I give all my information and maybe a document. If I go to Exchange B, I've got to do the same thing again. So all these exchanges have my information and documents. In a more efficient world, there would be some sort of reusable ID that once you signed up, you had a token that you owned, and you used that token to then open up your accounts, and your information was then transmitted to the other exchanges. So I think that's probably one of the most efficient ways.
Because we tried this in traditional finance with KYC utilities. It didn't work, right? Because there's always the incumbent bank who, frankly, wants it to be difficult for others to open an account, right? The question is, can we do this in crypto using some of the aspects that we have, right?
So Trulioo, we have a lot of the biggest exchanges, and they seem pretty open to ideas like this, as opposed to the traditional banks. The traditional banks were not open to sharing information.
So how are we going to deal with, let's say, I want to bring it up to you guys as well, like DeFi, right? As we're talking about, obviously, DeFi becoming a bigger part of our ecosystem, how do you guys think we're going to deal with not only KYC, but also other regulatory considerations with DeFi?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think, backing up sort of a moment, just started talking about the qualities of cryptocurrency or blockchains, right? The same qualities that make it such a force for good, right? Think remittances or transferring value to Ukraine, permissionless, decentralized, cross-border value transfer at the speed of the internet also makes it susceptible to illicit actors who want to move funds at the speed of the internet.
Yeah.
But the difference, the really extraordinary difference about open blockchains is that they are transparent and immutable. So you can follow the flow of funds in ways that you never could. I was a prosecutor for 11 years at the Department of Justice in the US. I did bulk cash smuggling cases and networks of hawalas and shell companies and high-value arts and real estate. There was no TRM labs for those things, right? You couldn't follow the flow of funds on an immutable public ledger. So the reality is that some of this is actually easier in crypto. Yeah. And we've seen that with some really tremendous cases where investigators were able to use tools to ultimately seize back stolen funds. You couldn't do that in traditional finance. So I think there are opportunities to use technology to do AML, to do KYC that never existed before.
So if, let's say, you got to give a piece of advice to anybody who wants to launder money in the room,
yeah,
they should not be using crypto.
Yeah. Definitely don't use crypto. I mean, the really extraordinary thing is, the blockchain.
Use cash. Yeah. Way better. Here you go.
Cash is king. Cash is king. Yeah.
Something you learned at TOKEN2049. Here we go. Your mom will be proud.
Yeah. Come find me at the booth later. We can talk about how to launder funds, like 10% of anything. So, yes, the blockchain is forever. A great example is you had the Bitfinex hack in 2016. Okay, 5 years later, the funds, the largest seizure of anything in U.S. history, 4.2 billion in cryptocurrency was seized ultimately. That is extraordinary. And the reality is that those people tried to move those funds for 5 years across blockchains and through darknet markets and mixers. Well, they couldn't ever off-ramp the funds. Yeah. It was a terrible way to launder money. And I think the reality is that blockchains allow us to do things that never were possible before. And that is missed in a lot of this sort of conversations amongst regulators about how susceptible it is to money laundering. Is the visibility is extraordinary.
Actually, on that point, obviously, there's a big conversation on the travel rule that we're talking about. Do you think the travel rule will have an impact on some of what Ari is mentioning?
I think so, yeah. So the whole concept.
Make a quick 30-second to the 30 second. What is a travel rule?
A travel rule is Swift for crypto. That's the easiest way to put it. Okay. So exchanges, custodians will have to exchange information on the parties to a transaction between one another. Now, obviously, that creates a whole new series of how do you actually move that data? How do you find out who's on the other end of it? But I think more importantly, it starts to then say, okay, we can see who's involved. We can prevent things like sanctions evasion. We can look better at our risk approach to money laundering and that kind of thing. So I think it will really help to solidify the industry. But there are huge risks around data privacy, data security, user experience. So I've seen all flavor of different things happening right now that could give rise to phishing, to hacks, to all sorts of other things. So it has to be done in the right way. And I've written a whole piece around how to do this, but looking at it, it's concerning that some are jumping into the approach without actually involving their CISO, their CTO, their CCO, their COO, because it affects everything across operations, across technology, across your security and data privacy. So doing it in the right way, I think it will really help. It will help to really drive even further bad actors away from this whole sector.
If done in the right way, which is a big question, right?
Yeah.
But don't you guys think, I mean, just what you're mentioning right now, there's a lot of traceability with blockchain, right? We have all the KYC information. And frankly, I would argue that the average, or let's say top 10 crypto exchange right now has probably better KYC AML than a lot of traditional banks, because they don't need to deal with the legacy systems. They can use latest technology like what you guys have, right? But don't you guys think that could be an obstacle? Ironically now, I probably have more privacy in payments if I use my old school bank account fiat SWIFT transfer than if I send you a Bitcoin transfer and people will be able to find out that it was my wallet sent by an exchange or I'm KYC'd. You don't think that this transparency may be deterrent at one point, maybe an obstacle to crypto as the industry continues to grow?
Yeah, I don't think so. What's so interesting is, like, I think we need to strike that balance, and that's really the key. And I think you see, smart regulators globally trying to figure out how do you strike the balance to ensure that regular users have a good experience, that there's not friction in the process, that they're able to have some level of anonymity. Look, as more and more transactions occur on open ledgers, people are going to want to have some privacy. They're going to want to use mixers. They're going to want to use anonymity-enhanced coins. The reality is we probably have more visibility today on blockchains than we will ever have. But, and it's a big but, at the same time, we got to stop bad guys from taking advantage of this ecosystem. Look, I'm not going to put my money on a DeFi protocol or on a centralized exchange if I think North Korea is going to hack it tomorrow and steal those funds. So it's really sort of striking the balance of how do you stop cyber criminals from taking advantage of this new financial system that we're all building, and at the same time ensure that regular users have some degree of privacy. And I think there are technological answers to this. I think technology can help. We're working on this at TRM all the time. We work with DeFi protocols on their front ends to ensure that they're screening for sanctions, to make sure that Lazarus Group is not transacting with their platforms. But the technology is continuing to evolve.
Yeah, I mean, even some of the recent reports we saw that we're able even to demix mixers, even some of the transactions, like you mentioned, Bitfinex, right? It was very interesting. But actually, I want to focus more on that, on Tornado Cash. Obviously, big topic recently. I mean, many would argue that, first of all, is it even possible? Can OFAC have the legal right to go and actually block a smart contract, first of all, when there's due process, they cannot defend themselves? What do you guys think of this whole Tornado Cash, let's say, situation? You think, did we go too far? Is it the right thing to do? Will it have a material impact? And what can be the negative impact you think it can have on the broader decentralized world?
What's Tornado Cash? I'm just kidding.
I've never used it.
It is really extraordinary. And look, over the last few years, we've seen regulators globally, particularly the U.S. Treasury Department, go after sort of clear illicit actors in the space, right? Darknet markets and non-compliant exchanges that there's tons of ransomware going through. And Tornado Cash was different because there were lots of regular users who, like I said, sort of were looking for some degree of anonymity. And those regular users were dramatically affected by these sanctions. And I think OFAC or Treasury is really trying to do kind of what I described, and that is walk that line between stopping bad actors like North Korea. I mean, look, the reality is, according to some analysis we did at TRM, $1 billion of hacked or stolen funds from North Korea went through Tornado Cash. I mean, that can't happen. But at the same time, we have to figure out a way sort of not to affect regular users. And I think you're starting to see them, regulators, try to walk that balance. You saw recently some frequently asked questions, FAQs come from OFAC to kind of describe like, hey, if you're the victim of a dusting attack, which means a small amount of funds were sent to you from Tornado Cash from a sanctioned address, then you're not going to be a target of enforcement actions. But the reality is the Tornado Cash is, I think, this extraordinary moment where we're going to have the conversation globally that we had sort of post 9/11, about security and privacy. And before we had those conversations in airports, now we're going to have them about blockchains. What level of privacy do you need, and are you willing to give up for security and vice versa? And I think Tornado Cash is the beginning of that conversation.
also think it varies country per country, right? What is the balance in China may be different from what it is in the US, for example, or Europe, right? Like the same debate we have with CBDCs, for example, right? So I think it's one on that side. But actually, like, again, just to focus on a decentralized role, like on DeFi, maybe I'll pass it to you, Reno, is we need to find a way to find that right balance in DeFi protocols, for example. What do you think could be that right balance? On KYC and on broader traceability as well.
So I think generally, and it's having the industry work with the regulators on the implementation. I think Tornado Cash is a good example. The wallets that were impacted indirectly through the sanctions action, I think weren't expected to cause that much of a burden on the other exchanges and on individuals. So I think working with exchanges, with industry experts, before coming down with this action is critical for regulators.
So cooperation with the industry. But you guys think I think the industry does a pretty good job, though, cooperating with the regulators and, frankly, law enforcement.
I think there's still further to go. So there's
you've been working with regulators.
And it depends where you go. So it depends which regulator you're talking to as to how advanced and how well they understand this. And a lot of it's about capacity. So it's capacity in terms of understanding whether it's law enforcement, whether it's policymakers. So let's go back one step to before the laws are actually written. It's not the regulators writing them, it's the policymakers. So you need your policymakers, you need law enforcement to be able to do the detection, you need the regulators who are then supervising and implementing all of this. And all of those need to get to the same point of understanding, and similarly actually in the opposite direction. So, for example, DeFi. What is it that regulation needs to solve here? It's stopping people from doing things they shouldn't be doing, and finding a way to be able to detect and stop that kind of behavior, and then being able to respond to legitimate requests from authorities on information, if anything does happen, that will allow them to then make a decision and say, okay, we can take further action or whatever. And being able to solve those two problems, that's really what we're trying to get to, so that we actually make the system a whole safer place to operate.
But how knowledgeable, let's say, actually, I'll come back to you as a former prosecutor, right? How knowledgeable are, let's say, law enforcement? Again, from 1 to 10, on crypto, or the relevant departments in law enforcement on crypto?
Yeah, it's a really interesting moment, and the answer to your questions differs across jurisdictions.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's start with the US, for example.
I'd say that sort of federal law enforcement in the US is becoming more and more sophisticated. The FBI, for example, has stood up a virtual asset unit. The US Department of Justice has a national cryptocurrency enforcement team. And look, as you're looking across regulatory bodies, Singapore, extremely sophisticated in the way they're thinking about regulation. Dubai, UAE, same. But then it certainly differs. And I think one of the things FATF, which Malcolm does a ton of work in, the Financial Action Task Force, is trying to figure out is how do you deal with jurisdictions that don't have not really thought through sort of regulation. But the reality is, we are so early. And I often say, like, it's great to have a virtual asset unit, but every unit is going to have to understand cryptocurrency, right? There's no cryptocurrency crime. That is not a thing. Crypto is just the currency used in the commission of many crimes, every crime, just like cash is. So every agent across every agency globally is going to need to understand how to trace funds, how to interact with DeFi protocols and NFT marketplaces. And that's coming. But again, like, I know it's like a cop-out to keep saying it, but it is so early in this space, and so many of us have been in it for a while.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about regulation, when you're talking about law enforcement, it's day one.
Yeah. But I think it's been interesting actually seeing in regulators how they've really got up to speed in many very impressive ways, right? You mentioned some regulators there, I think quite interestingly. You mentioned NFT marketplaces, right? So obviously there's a lot of data, there's a lot of reports coming out, and of the amount of illicit activity taking place with NFTs. Would you guys think that it's easier now to either launder money or create fake source of funds with NFTs than it is with traditional, let's call digital assets like crypto, like ETH or Bitcoin?
I think it's similar, and my 10% deal still stands for the NFTs if we want to talk NFTs. Look, I think what regulators would say globally, and quite frankly, there's very little to no regulation anywhere on sort of how to regulate the NFT space. But I think what regulators would say is if you could transfer value at the speed of the internet across borders, they're going to regulate this in some way or another. And if you look out there, the major NFT marketplaces are using tools like TRM today to monitor transactions, to ensure that they're not sending an NFT to a sanctioned address. Yeah. So a lot of the things that sort of, Reno was talking about earlier are in place at major markets. But I will say, like, bust out the crystal ball for a moment And over the next few years, I think this is going to be a huge focus for regulators globally. The US Treasury Department did a white paper 6 months or so ago on just the money laundering in traditional art markets. And they basically said, there's too much friction. This is not a huge money laundering concern, which I was sort of like, well, there may be some concern here. But there were like 4 or 5 pages on NFTs, which is the first time that the US Treasury Department, really any regulator, has delved into that. And what they said is we have serious concerns in this space because of how little friction there is in transferring value here. And I think what that to me says is, look, this is something they're thinking about. And just to sort of finish up here, the White House executive order that we talked about a moment ago ordered Treasury over the next 6 months to study risks in the NFT space. So there's going to be a lot more coming in that space.
But obviously now we're talking about solutions, we're talking about regulation, we're talking about technology solutions that both Trulioo and TRM labs have. But if I look at some of the recent hacks, Ronin hack, which frankly was not it was a policy procedure gap that we had. And if you look at it recently, what we had at OpenSea, old school front running, what we also had at the recently with Coinbase as well, right? Do you guys think that maybe these are some of the elements, the gaps that we have in the industry? Like for anybody who's running a crypto business right now, yeah, obviously get tools like TRM and Trulioo, but also your internal policies and procedures are as important, if not more important, based on some of the recent events that we saw, including for the protocols, by the way, token teams as well, like we saw with Ronin, for example.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think from a Ronin perspective, these are cybersecurity issues. And I hate to sort of say like, hey, this is not a crypto problem, this is a cyber problem, but the reality is you got to build out your cyber defenses. And any crypto business that's building today really needs to ensure that their cybersecurity is foundational. Because we got to stop these hacks from happening in the first place. It's great to have tools like TRM to follow the funds once they happen, and it's great for regulators and law enforcement to ultimately figure out ways to seize them back, and we've seen some of that, but we've got to stop the hacks from happening in the first place because, look, North Korea, early adopter, learned that, hey, I can actually steal money directly from these exchanges to fund weapons proliferation and other destabilizing activity. And the reality is, like, we've got to stop that from happening. And just sort of the last piece to this is, and it's not just national security, right? Like I said a minute ago, if we want this ecosystem to grow and flourish, we have to build trust. And we got to stop these types of hacks and frauds from happening in the first place. But there's a lot of cybersecurity issues.
But it's cyber, but it's also policy. Like, I'm amazed that I meet still so many crypto funds and crypto exchanges where there's no personal account trading policies, or they're very loose, especially as we move down the ladder, right, of companies. I mean, those are pretty obvious. I
think that's
talk about trust.
Yeah, that's a maturity piece. So if you come from traditional banking, you're used to this. I should say you're used to this. If you saw the news yesterday in the US, and there was a huge series of fines by CFTC and SEC for using personal devices for trading and trading discussions. That actually points to the maturity, right? That you think, you think this is okay, but actually it's not. And you shouldn't be doing this. So yes, there's policy. You need to have those policies in place. You need to have the education in place. And then you need the monitoring, the technology in place to actually then almost like seal the doors and say, okay, we've got everything in place. Policies are far more than just, for example, AML, CFT, sanctions, that you're going to present in your license application and say, yeah, that's okay, I can go get my license now. It is everything. It's codes of conduct. It is personal trading. It's privacy. It's all of these things that come together.
But that's an area I would argue that the traditional banks have actually a lot of experience and expertise and policies, and the industry has been quite mature, has been dealing with it. Do you think that could be actually competitive advantage as these traditional financial institutions come in, that on these areas they tick the box for many of the institutional investors who want to enter the space? Like, do you think this will have an impact on traditional banks entering the space?
I think it will. I think it goes hand in hand, though. I mean, and I've been at another event recently where we were talking about exactly this and the institutional impact and how institutions are coming into this space now, whether it's building their own, custodian solution or their own trading desk and things like that. They have the advantage that they can bring some of that with them, but then it also comes at the risk of, is it too rigid in the shape? Does the shape still fit, or is it a square peg round hole kind of thing? So making sure that whatever the policy is dynamic enough or shaped in the way that it makes sense. Because if you say, okay, I have, for example, if you're trading shares, you have to do it on this certain platform or with this certain broker so that we can monitor all your trades. In the crypto world, that may not apply because there are so many venues where you can go to actually do your trading, and you can do the whole thing through DeFi. So It has to be approached in a slightly different way, but still it comes with that experience and with that knowledge of, we know how we did it over here, and now we can apply it over here.
I mean, one thing that's amazing to see is, like, and I don't know if it's maturation or just evolution, but I mean, every major financial institution in the world is at some place on their crypto journey today. Are we banking crypto customers? Are we offering crypto assets to customers? Are we, do we have our own coin, like, JP Morgan? So, like, I moderated a panel a few months ago with the heads of digital assets from State Street and BNY Mellon and Goldman, and there are some really sophisticated players in this space today who are just sort of getting into this. And I think we're seeing an evolution where VASPs are going to be financial institutions and financial institutions are going to be VASPs. And we're going to see that play out over the next few years.
So those of you who work for traditional banks, there is some value add you could add to the crypto industry.
a lot of value. A lot of value. It's really important.
Based on this, right? So what is the biggest risk for any chief compliance officer, anybody's in a compliance role or even an executive role at a crypto company? What is the biggest risk you think to watch right now? What should they keep? What should keep them up at night from a regulatory perspective? I'll start with you right now, and we'll move there.
I think watching the regulations, because a lot of the compliance
watching regulation.
Yes, watching what's happening in the regulatory space and the enforcement actions. Because a chief compliance officer in the past might not have been concerned about insider trading at OpenSea, for example. But when those actions happen, it's a message to the industry that these are the types of things that the chief compliance officer should be looking at and coming up with policies and ways to monitor or prevent them.
It's a good one, and I think that's an area where there's so much expertise anyways from TradFi, right? And Ari, what do you think anybody in an executive role should watch out for? What's the biggest risk?
I think the scary part is it doesn't matter how great a job you do, because a lot of it, so much it depends on your counterparty. And that's true in traditional finance as well. I mean, look, if you're FTX or Binance or Coinbase and you have giant compliance teams and have policies and procedures and are using TRM and doing all these things sort of the right way, you still have to worry about, interacting with jurisdictions that don't have these types of compliance controls in place. What happens when you deal with the SUXs and the ChatXs and the Garantex, these non-compliant VASPs out there in the ecosystem that don't have the same controls. So, I talked to someone from MAS recently, and what they will essentially tell you is, look, even regulators are only as strong as the weakest link in the system. And you can have rock solid regulation in Singapore or in the US or in the UK, but the reality is, jurisdictional arbitrage is a real thing.
Unfortunately, right? And that's what FATF is trying to tackle, right? Malcolm, what is the biggest risk the guys should watch out for?
So I think building on that, the two things I call out are know your customers. Actually, do you know them? I mean, there's multiple layers you can go through. It's more than just collecting a passport and saying I'm done. There's a whole load of tech that you can put behind the scenes to really understand and make sure you know without actually affecting the customer journey. So I think that's the first thing. The second one is actually consumer protection, which again has
consumer protection.
Consumer protection, so your user protection. And that's not just security, that's the access to certain products and things like that. This is the big one that's coming down the track right now. So there will be a lot of conversations. Ravi Menon here, a couple of weeks ago, made the point that consumer protection and the whole retail access conversation and how you actually manage that, those kinds of things are going to be I think the narrative we'll see. It will move. There's still going to be a very big, wave of the AML piece. There's the regulatory arbitrage and all of that. But I think that there's going to be a lot more focus, particularly because of what has happened in the last few months. We will see consumer protection, user protection taking that front center stage.
So on the first point, actually many people don't know, Malcolm was instrumental in building WorldCheck that many people used back in his days at Thomson Reuters. But on the second point, I think the first part I agree. The way that we're using passports and an address, I mean, it's outdated. It's actually embarrassing we're still using that in crypto, right? I mean, the problem is there's no better way. But anyways, we discussed that already. On the consumer protection, I think this is an area we don't talk a lot. And obviously, we saw what happened with Celsius and actually some companies here as well, in Singapore as well, HODLNOT and others. What do you guys think is going to be the best way for consumer protection? Of course, if I go to some exchanges now, they ask me these 2-3 stupid questions, which frankly doesn't make me more knowledgeable from a consumer protection perspective. In TradFi, we often have a money amount, that if my minimum investment is X amount, I'm an accredited investor. I'm a sophisticated just because I have money, but I can be an idiot with money, which is a big thing as well. What do you guys think we can have on a consumer protection side? What do you think is the way? Can we as a community reinvent how.
I think you nailed it with the question. Like, I love how you phrased that because there's all kinds of regulations that you can do, and we've seen it, and MAS has done a really good job. But look, I mean, the nature of crypto and the blockchain allows for visibility and allows for actually the community to police itself. At TRM, we work with Binance and Aave and all these different entities, Circle, on something called chain abuse. And chain abuse is just a free website where people report scams and frauds. I think of it as like a Waze for crypto, where we can actually self-police some of this stuff,
That's awesome.
which was never possible in fiat, right? It's just like a place where you can go to report scams and frauds to make sure that other people in the space are not being able to, are not being taken advantage of. You can report to law enforcement if you want to. So I think that there are ways for the community to police itself.
Yeah, I think so. I would say that the industry needs to do as much as it can without the regulators coming in, because if the industry just goes, we'll wait and see what happens, we'll just let ride along on the wave and kind of continue as we are, then you know that the regulators are going to come up and come fairly fast with, we're going to impose this kind of restriction. So for example, I'm not a fan of only accredited investors or only professional investors can trade crypto. I don't think that's the approach. I think it has so many negative impacts and unintended consequences that sit behind it. As you said, the fact that you've got money doesn't mean that you know what you're doing with it. It just means you've got money. But there are plenty of, for example, developers who may not be accredited investors, but know exactly what they're doing. So we need to be able to better segment. Now, there's various ways that might be done, but we need to have a better way to segment and be able to prove I know what I'm doing. I can trade spot. I can trade derivatives. I can trade or buy and sell NFTs, whatever it might be. But at least have that level of being able to understand I can prove what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing. Therefore, I should have access rather than just a blanket. It's going to sit there. And I think this is where, going back to Ravi's talk, he was sort of saying this. That MAS is looking at this. But I think as well that, actually I think it's the point you made earlier, Reno, about there needs to be that public-private dialogue. So there has to be a point where the industry says, hey, look, this is how we think we can solve this. And here's how we prove it, and prove it with data, prove it with the ability to
and just to
really
shout
that
out. I mean, this is what Malcolm has done better than anyone in our space. Is like brought the public and private sector together to have these kinds of conversations. I mean, it's awesome.
And I think you're right, because the consumer protection, especially after Celsius and everything that happened, it's a slam dunk. I mean, it's a layup for regulators, and frankly, maybe rightly so, to try to protect it. And I think as a community, if we don't work together on these issues, then we're going to be imposed certain conditions that probably are not in the best interest of the community and frankly our users as well, right? So, guys, before we move to my 5-round round of questions, a bit of controversial one, but obviously we're talking about regulations today and regulatory advances in crypto. And I hope 2022 will be a year of regulatory advances. What is the one regulator that you think is quite impressive? Like, what is the one country you think is getting it right when it comes to rulemaking, policy making? I'll start from you, Reno, and we'll move on.
Yeah, so getting it right means, in my mind, explicitly stating what's required and what's expected, and then also implementing it correctly. And so far on the policy side, you've seen MiCA come out in Europe, and it's a great framework.
Europe,
Yes, great framework. But to answer your question, I think a better one is actually in the UAE, where there have been these working groups, and the regulators have been working very closely with the private sector, and also established a separate regulatory group or regulatory agency, so you're not mixing traditional financial regulators with crypto regulators and them being confused in how to examine or audit these companies.
VARA in Dubai getting obviously a lot of traction. So you're going with Dubai, VARA, UAE. Ari, on your side, I think he's doing a job.
Admittedly, we should have deconflicted this. I was going to say UAE. I think there are a handful of regulators globally. I think the UAE is one. I think the UK is really starting to put out some really thoughtful regulation in this space. Everyone's been very concerned about things like unhosted wallets for some time, and they came out and said that really thread the needle and said, look, unhosted wallets are not inherently high risk, right? They're just people like us who don't want to interact with an exchange, but you can do extra due diligence. And that's what you should do. And it's like there are market solutions. So I think the UK has done a good job. I think that, not to play to the home team, but I think MAS has really been thoughtful and shown a lot of expertise in this space as well.
Interesting. So UAE, MAS, and UK. UK I didn't expect. Interesting.
Yeah, I know.
Malcolm, I'll pass it to you.
What Ari said. That's it. No, For actually the same reasons. I think, yeah, UK, very thoughtful. I like their positioning on unhosted wallets.
Really, despite all the website warnings that are, you know, and some of the warnings, really?
Yeah, but you know,
nothing against FCA, by the way, but
I mean, they're developing in that sense that they know their perimeters. They're laying out what the perimeters are and what they can and can't regulate and what they can. But they're starting to articulate the message very well. UAE is just moving at light speed, which is kind of what crypto is, right? It's evolving very fast. There needs to be that speed of evolution. And then MAS, because it's just been a solid progress, and there's been a lot of collaboration between MAS and the industry, particularly in different facets, and there's been some very clear messaging of late.
Yeah, I think the UAE, it's been actually for even our hedge fund as well. We got a provisional approval in Dubai for that reason. It's very refreshing when you deal with a regulator who's focused on crypto, and it makes it's better regulations, better surveillance as well. And anyhow, guys, we have a couple minutes left. My best friend, the Bell, is back. I'm gonna ask you quick questions. I want 1 or 2 word answers. Okay? You guys ready? I'm gonna start with you, Reno. Reno, if you were not in crypto, what would you do?
Payments.
Payments. Ari, if you're not in crypto, what other industry would you be in?
I'd be the shortstop for the New York Yankees.
Shortstop for the New York Yankees.
Absolutely,
well, hopefully they'll have a better year than what they've had in the recent ones. Malcolm?
Sitting in Bali doing yoga.
Malcolm, actually, next question. What's your favorite thing to do on weekends when you're not busy with crypto and your job?
Hiking.
Hiking. Well, good Hong Kong activity. Ari?
Chasing my 2 boys around.
There you go. How old are they?
8 and 11.
Oh, man, there's a lot of chasing there. Reno, what do you do on your weekends when you're not busy on crypto with Trulioo?
Watching Lion King with my 4-year-old daughter.
Same age. I'm watching the same thing 20 times as well. Reno, I'm going to start with you. If you can go back to university today, what is the one course you would take that you wish you had taken back in the day? Next one, Ari.
Data science. I'm a lawyer who works at a tech company. It would be so cool to have a little bit more grounded in that.
Absolutely, and smart contract coding with law as well.
Exactly.
You took my answer again. Blockchain.
Blockchain course.
Blockchain development. Yeah.
Being offered. I'm sorry for you, Malcolm. Elon Musk decides to buy a crypto company. Which one should he buy and why?
Shift, because I work for them. Shift, because I work for them, which is a...
Harry.
I have no idea.
Elon Musk is buying a company, crypto. Which one should he buy?
Coinbase. I don't know.
Tomorrow, you're offered, I'm going to start with you, Reno. You're offered to be the CEO, the head of any regulatory body around the world. Which regulator would you want to go and lead tomorrow morning?
MAS, Singapore.
Singapore, here you go. Home turf.
Oh, U.S. Treasury.
U.S. Treasury. They may need some help soon, so Malcolm.
I'll go with, I don't know, Vara, because it's all new and shiny.
Oh, that's cool.
Vara, Dubai.
Yeah.
We're in Singapore, guys. Favorite thing about Singapore? Malcolm?
The energy.
What?
The energy.
Energy, absolutely.
Awesome. All of that.
Absolutely.
I had an awesome run this morning along the harbor past the Merlion, and it's just an awesome city.
He's training for his marathons.
Exactly. Yeah.
Reno, what's your favorite thing about Singapore?
The food, the flavors, and different types of food.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a minute left. If you have one piece of advice to the audience where they can go learn about crypto, what do you recommend? What they should read, follow, what they should do?
Go to trulioo.com. There's a lot of information there and more to come.
There you go. Your content team will be happy. Ari.
I mean, I have to say, follow me on LinkedIn. but my serious answer is this, in all seriousness, like there's so much great content out there, so much to read, but in the regulatory space, read enforcement actions, right?
Yeah,
read the actual actions where regulators are going after folks in the space, because just don't do those things. And then problem solved, right?
Malcolm.
Took my answer again. Follow Henri. Follow Henri. Take his course.
Last question, guys, to finish up the crypto panel. If you could have lunch or dinner with one person, dead or alive. Lunch with one person, dead or alive. Reno, with you.
Steve Jobs.
Why is that?
Just because of his mind and how he turned everything around in the company and how he did that.
Ari,
Alexander Hamilton, because he's young, scrappy, and hungry, like we all are in the crypto space. But yeah, he built a new financial system. just like we are. And it's an extraordinary moment, and it was back then too.
Steve Jobs, Mr. Hamilton, and to finish it off, the regulatory panel at TOKEN2049 2022 in Singapore. Malcolm, if you could have lunch or dinner with one person, dead or alive, who would that be?
Satoshi Nakamoto. Just know who he is.
Guys, thank you very much for the panel today. That was a great honor being with you all. See you guys soon. Thank you.